This is another chapter of Beyond the Brink and Fighting Back, and it's an unusual one. Normally, when I plan these, I'm thinking to bring people that you would be interested in hearing. This week, I brought somebody who I was interested in hearing. Beau Breslin is a professor, political science expert, a constitutional law expert from Skidmore College. He is one of my replacements on WAMC on the Roundtable. I recently heard him speak to Colony Indivisible, and normally I sit through those meetings yawning, waiting to get home. And yours, I wanted to continue, Beau. It was amazing. He got everybody talking and asking questions, and he's talking, get this, about constitutional law, not the sort of thing, sports or sex or something really interesting. So I knew right then and there that I was going to ask him on, and he has agreed to do this. I'm so happy. Hi, Beau.
Rosemary, I have to say I'm so thrilled to be here, and for those who are listening, you're such a hero to so many of us. You know, a fierce patriot, a great liberal, just a voice in this darkness, and so it is truly an honor to be on your show.
You begin to see why I like him. So where should we begin? How about here? I have a suggestion. When you spoke to Colony Indivisible, you made a statement that we did not have really time to like jump all over you about, and that was that you do not think that at this time we are in a constitutional crisis. And I got to say, we're at a war right now that has no input from Congress. We have an increasing number of federal judges who are trying to figure out what to do with an administration blatantly ignoring their orders. Like, for example, shipping off undocumented people despite orders not to ship them off. We have an attack going on against birthright citizenship by the president. Independent media is being attacked. Even the cherished Second Amendment is on shaky ground these days. Congress seems to have abdicated on its role in balancing out executive authority. So, in short, just what would it take for you to say, yeah, now we're in a constitutional crisis?
Yeah. So I think, Rosemary, I think a couple of things. I'll start by saying this. I don't believe we're in a constitutional crisis, but that does not mean I think that the Constitution is unbroken. I believe it's broken. So the Constitution itself, and that's a different question, right? So I would reform the Constitution. But getting back to your original question, under the current constitutional guidelines, for the most part, the institutions of government are functioning the way they're supposed to function. We may not like the outcome of this. I can't stand the outcome of many policy initiatives. I can't stand the fact that Congress has abdicated its responsibility and is basically impotent. I can't stand the fact that we have a largely conservative judiciary, but as far as institutions are concerned, they're doing the job that that Madison and the framers set out to do. I think that said, I think that what would it take for us to be in a constitutional crisis? I think there are a couple things. One is if the executive branch, and in particular the president, utterly defied a Supreme Court ruling, right? So presidents defy lower court rulings all the time. Obama did it, Bush did it, Clinton did it. That's fairly common. That's why we have, as you know, that's why we have these appeal processes. But it's been a long time since the Supreme Court, since the executive branch has defied a Supreme Court opinion. Andrew Jackson, right, might have been the last one to truly do that. If that happens, we're in a constitutional crisis because that means the institutions are not working. And the second thing I'll say is, Rosemary, I think we'd be in a constitutional crisis if there were some serious shenanigans about the midterm elections. You know, every day in this country, there are elections. They are typically local elections. And so 5, 6, 7 times a week, we're having elections. And those are happening. You know, again, I'm not happy with the shift to the right in the country. But as long as those elections are happening, it's fine. If come November, we're in a situation where those elections are suspended, those elections are simply ignored. And I think the third one is those elections are questioned as the Republicans have done with Stop the Steal, I think then we're in a real constitutional crisis.
Okay, so we are getting close because those are
Yeah,
matters under discussion right now.
for sure.
I think Congress even is looking at ways to help the president's agenda to
Yeah.
stop or slow down the vote going on right now about the Save the Vote, horrible name for a voter suppression act, and that's I mean, we're hanging on by a thread on that. So you do see that we're close,
Yeah, I think that so what's interesting is that right now it doesn't look like the SAVE Act is going to pass. So
right?
that's the institutions working the way they should. We can talk
Right,
about the filibuster and so on.
right.
If if the SAVE Act passes and there's an extension or an expansion of the ways in which Republicans, and I'll say this, it's absolutely
It
just
is, yeah,
Republicans,
yeah,
the way in which Republicans make it increasingly difficult for people to vote, in some ways we're back to a broader Jim Crow situation where it becomes not just race, but it becomes difficult for most Americans to vote, or at least a vast number of Americans. Then we're in a constitutional crisis.
yeah. I mean, we're talking silliness now that women are trying to find birth certificates that match their current names, which is a married name they didn't have when they're born. It's nuts.
That's right.
Um,
That's right.
and
And I think you're talking about millions of Americans that
right,
will not be able to satisfy the requirements of that act.
right, right. Okay, so how about a war that we have now? When you spoke to Colony a few months ago, we were not at war with Iran.
Correct.
Now we are, and war has been used in the past as an excuse to change, alter, delay, whatever elections. Can you see that happening? Am I crazy to bring it up?
Not at all. I think there's a likelihood that something if this war extends into the summer, and I can't see an off ramp at this point. If this extends into the summer and into the early fall, you are going to see an increased attention, increased conversation about delaying the November vote. That I think is seriously problematic. So I think this war, as you know, the Trump administration does two things better than any other administration has ever done, both of which I would describe as sinister, right?
Mhm.
One is expanding the meaning and definition of legislation and constitutional guardrails so that he stretches it as much as he possibly can.
Right.
And in fact, I think he probably breaks down those traditional guardrails in ways that are we can't repair them. So he does that. And we can talk about that. That's the birthright citizenship
Yep,
stuff. That's
yep.
the tariff stuff. All of this is an expansive interpretation of executive power. So he does that, and then he plays the shell game. The second thing is
Mhm.
he tries to distract in a way that no other president has distracted. He's surrounded by people who are changing the game of politics, not for the better, but we're in a different environment about politics now.
I've been amazed first term and now with the way he has this whole cadre of lawyers who seem intent on staying within the law, but working around the intent
Correct.
of it to get. So you saw Eastman, for example, who said, "Oh yeah, yeah, we can nullify this election. We never heard that stuff before."
Never.
And right, and now the attack on a third term, which I'm not sure he's even healthy enough to manage, but he gets a third term because there's nothing in the amendment that says consecutive or non-consecutive. That's pretty clever. I don't know
Yeah,
if it'll work, but you got to give him credit for coming up with. It's like you said, he's got a genius for
yeah.
seeing how to break the Constitution.
And as I said, as I've said in a couple of different places, I think there are two ways in which the fight about his third term is going to be more significant than we think, right? One is the way you just mentioned, right? So you have this notion of non-consecutive. And the Trump administration, unlike the first administration, Rosemary,
Right.
this administration really does know how to maneuver within the what I describe as sort of the absences, the constitutional omissions, right? So they're
Absolutely. The loophole, every
the
loophole they have
loopholes.
found. Hmm.
Yeah, and they're superb at it, unlike the clowns that he was with in the first, who were actually decent politicians, but understood that the traditional notion of guardrails and so on should
Right,
remain, right?
right.
So I think the issue of whether a president can serve consecutive terms or not is one way. The other way is very possible. The 22nd Amendment says no president shall be elected to more than two
Oh,
terms.
right.
So you're in a situation where you can have easily J.D. Vance winning the presidency,
Yep.
somebody as the vice
Abdicating.
president,
Yeah.
both of them abdicate. The Speaker of the House can be anybody. It can be you and me. It doesn't have to be an elected official. That Speaker of the House, if the Republicans get back the majority, I think they'll lose it during the midterm. If they get back the
If we
majority,
have midterms.
yep, if we have midterms. But if that Speaker of the House, if the Republicans get it back, they make Trump Speaker of the House. They can make anybody, and he is
Wow.
elevated to the presidency when J.D. Vance and the vice president abdicate.
Amazing.
Yep.
Frightening thought. You also have some scary thoughts about how he can get around it's not even an amendment. It's right in the Constitution in Maine about birthright citizenship. And he can get around that too. You do not think that's a slam dunk for birthright citizenship withstanding the assault.
And this is the thing, Rosemary, that where I mean, I have to admit to your listeners, I've been caught a bit unaware or unprepared about this Trump administration, the second Trump administration. I did not think, if you had asked me on January 20th, Inauguration Day, if you had asked me that whether the 14th Amendment, the
Hmm.
greatest constitutional clause in, I'm willing to say, the world, right? Because our
Hmm.
Constitution changed the world, and that 14th Amendment was the manifestation of the liberal experiment in Republican government. It's the greatest clause in the Constitution because it says no state shall deny any person life, liberty, or property without due process, privileges and immunities, or equal protection. That was the culmination of the first 100 years or so of our churning liberal experiment.
Right.
If you could have told me on January 20th that birthright citizenship, the idea that people born in the United States were automatically American citizens, was up for debate, I would have told you you were nuts.
Right.
Today, I'm not so sure. And the reason is because and we can talk about it, this Supreme Court is, I think it's less Trumpian than lots of people say, but it's still very Trumpian.
Yes.
This Supreme Court could possibly focus on the clause that John Sauer, Solicitor General, and others are focusing on. The 14th Amendment says all persons born and naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state in
And
which they
there is the
reside.
clause with the problem.
And subject to the jurisdiction thereof, there is a way for this Supreme Court, and I think Alito and Thomas will jump on this. There is a way for the Supreme Court to say people who are undocumented or just visitors who have a kid here are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. They're subject to the jurisdiction of their own country.
Right.
If we do that, you talk about the original question. If the Supreme Court does that, I have to believe that the left's protest will step up even more. I think we would be in a constitutional crisis in that moment.
That's terrifying and yet completely possible. I always worried about the emoluments clause,
Yeah.
also in the main, not an amendment.
Yep.
And makes such common sense that a president can't accept payments from a foreign government that's trying to influence it.
That's
Yet Trump has skirted that from his entire first term, and it's just blatant now. We
yeah.
have Jared Kushner right now, who's negotiating for the United States in Gaza and in Ukraine, and he's soliciting money from the Saudis who want a war with Iran. That's the definition of what the founding fathers were trying to avoid.
Exactly.
And it's in the open, and no one is upset about it. except the people are going to be marching on No King's Day on March 28th. Is that really true?
Yeah.
Are we at that stage?
Yeah, and I'm going to go even further and say, let's think about this. And I'm not disparaging the Saudis, but so 2000, Obama negotiates the Iran nuclear deal, right? In 2015. It's not perfect. Israel doesn't love it. I get it, but it bought time in a way that I think was super important. But what it also did, Rosemary, was it made Iran less of a pariah in the region, right?
Right.
It is a serious pariah in that region. It brings Iran a little bit back towards the mainstream in the Arab world.
Right.
Who's going to be most irritated by that uh, in an environment in which Trump is trying to gin up business in Saudi Arabia? It's the Saudis who are going to be most
Absolutely.
irritated by Iran, which is it has the potential to be a very wealthy, very democratic country. If you bring Iran back in, the Saudis lose out a little bit. Trump, as a result, I think rips up the Obama deal, the Iran nuclear deal, because I think in part he's trying to placate the Saudis, who he wants to have a long-term business relationship with,
Yep.
i.e., Jared Kushner.
Yeah. And yet the Constitution did not protect against that.
No, of course not. We're in an environment in which this is problematic. And is it a constitutional crisis? No, but it's getting close. We're in an environment in which the Trump administration and the Trump family flaunts their business dealings and the emoluments they're getting from foreign nationals.
Yes, they are. Okay. And we have to take a breath here because we've gone at it. I need to remind our listeners that this is Beyond the Brink, and I'm talking with Beau Breslin, who is, as you can see, pretty knowledgeable about the court and the Constitution and how, in this case, it's not working. So here's my question to you. You pick the worst Supreme Court decision. Here's your choices: Dred Scott, Citizens United, or the presidential immunity bill, the immunity decision. What do you think?
So, I mean,
They're all terrible.
they're all terrible. I think they're terrible for different reasons. So I will promise you, I will make a decision, right?
Okay, you're not going to hedge. Don't be a
I'm not going to
politician
hedge,
here.
but
Okay.
I'm going to remind your listeners why they're terrible. So Dred Scott is terrible because of the fact that it's the most racist statement in probably political history, and we've had a fair number of those. When Chief Justice Taney refuses to acknowledge citizenship for African Americans, they can't sue in my court, Taney says, because they are not citizens; they are property. Right? You can't get worse than that from a symbolic
Mhm.
perspective. Is that sort of the most cringy, just disgusting opinion of the three, probably? At the end of the day, though, today, I think Citizens United has a claim to be the most destructive
Right.
of the Supreme Court opinions because it allows for money which has always dominated politics, to dominate politics in a way that makes it impossible for you and me to have any real influence. Right.
Right.
So Citizens United allows individual corporations to give unlimited amounts of money because it constitutes speech to political action committees, but it allows the Elon Musks of the world to basically buy elections at $285 million. There was a time, Rosemary, in our recent past where $285 million given by one person in the 2024 election was more than the amount spent by both candidates in any presidential election.
Mm-hmm.
So Citizens United, I think, is the most destructive in terms of sort of the overall political world. And then, of course, the Trump immunity case, especially when the Supreme Court says the Department of Justice is basically an arm of the president,
Mm-hmm.
that I think has targeted destructive capabilities that allow Trump to do anything he wants. I think that one is problematic from our perspective in the future. But if I was to, and I told you I would do one, if I was to rank the one that's most the worst decision for the Supreme Court, it's hard to not say Dred Scott, but I'll say Citizens United because I think money is just the real problem in American politics.
Did I leave out any cases that might be under that should
No,
have been nominated?
no, those
I
are
mean,
the three ones that
no,
belong on the Mount Rushmore.
they're pretty glaring. Continue talking about the court. Professor Breslin is an expert on this. Trump doesn't just disobey the lower courts. He disregards them. They are like little roadblocks to get him to the Supreme Court where he has his way. So I think he just discounts both the district courts and the appeals courts. He doesn't care about anything. And whenever my liberal friends like start celebrating a wonderful, fiery anti-Trump decision at the lower level, I say, just hold on, because it doesn't count till you get to the big court. And he's been winning there. Except until the tariffs case, quite consistently. Is that unusual? Have we seen that in history before?
Yeah, I mean that's the nature of our appeals court process, both at the state level and at the federal level. Lower courts are obviously going to make decisions that affect parties and affect regions of the country and so on, but presidents ignore them a lot. They're going through the appeal process. One of the things I will say, I'll say a couple of things. One is the only case where I remind people, and I'm holding on to this hope. I don't know if it's a successful hope, but I'm holding on to this hope. The only case that this term that the Supreme Court has listened to the merits of the case, heard oral argument in the case, and ruled in terms of a Trump type situation was the tariffs case. Let's talk for a minute about the shadow docket. Bo, that
was my next question, because I think the disregard for the lower courts, like the Supreme Court's the only federal court that matters, and the use of the secret docket has changed the federal judiciary. It is not working now the way it has in all the years I remember.
You are so right about that, Rosemary. The fact of the matter is that again, going back to what we talked about 10 minutes ago, the Trump administration is particularly savvy and particularly capable of using these sort of, I would describe them as sort of secret passageways to get their way. And the shadow docket is one of those. Have presidents
explain to my listeners what that is. We're using the term like everyone knows.
So what this is informally known as the shadow docket. The way it works at the Supreme Court is that about 12,000 cases or so are brought to the Supreme Court every year, and the court decides which one it wants to hear, quote, on the merits, meaning we're going to have a full briefing, we're going to have oral argument, we're going to schedule it, it's going to be one of written opinions, it's going to take a long time, those sorts of things. They do about 60 of those. But there are ones that the court has to decide. Death penalty cases are a good example. You want to appeal your case before your death penalty case before the Supreme Court. They can't wait, right? So they have to make decisions quickly that are always temporary. So Trump uses this, what's called the shadow docket, this sort of temporary opinion making that's not fully briefed or the oral argument hasn't happened. He's used the shadow docket to get his way on a lot of things. And the one thing that all shadow docket cases have in common is that they're temporary fixes until the court has time to hear the entire argument. And Trump wins those over and over and over again. He has barely lost one of those shadow docket temporary cases.
This court seems very willing to let practices that they say outright, they may well be ruled unconstitutional, but they can go on for now.
That's right.
right?
And that's exactly right. And so what happens is, and this is partly because, as I say, Rosemary, you've heard me say this, elections matter. We put a president in office both in 2016 and in 2024, but especially in 2016, who was able to get a sixth conservative on the court, a sixth right-wing conservative. And then all of a sudden, you might have moderates like Roberts and maybe Kavanaugh who are just outvoted by by the Alitos and Thomases of the world. They can't do anything, right? I'm always struck by the fact that, Roberts is desperately trying to do something to hold on to the reputation of the court, but he loses. He
He's in the
has
minority.
he has no authority anymore, even as Chief Justice, because there are five justices who are voting against him. So the shadow docket is a way in which you can get a temporary victory, but those are important victories. They're super important.
Yeah.
So the tariff case is the one case where the court has decided that Trump is wrong and Trump's power is too significant. That maybe gives us some hope that the Supreme Court has a backbone. Maybe.
And of course, Trump, with his very smart and slippery lawyers, has found a way in a law, a congressional law,
That's
to
right.
stave off any kind of accountability for that for a while.
That's right.
I'm just still, though, I think there's more to this. You have district courts now that have really very little power. They write eloquent dissents and beautiful outrage statements about what's happening, and then it just all goes away. It used to be that district and appeals level where thorny issues got ironed out, right? Before they went and they were finessed over and made national by the Supreme Court. We have lost that.
Yeah, so I'll tell you this one. I'll tell you a little bit of a, I don't know, it's a addendum to our birthright citizenship case. So the birthright citizenship case, this 14th Amendment case about whether or not people born in the United States are automatically citizens of the United States. There was another, and you'll remember this, not that long ago, 4 or 5 months ago, there was another part to this. The original birthright citizenship case issue that came to the court was an issue about whether or not a lower court judge or the appeals court judge could do what's called national injunctions.
Right.
So as soon as the story goes like this, Rosemary, and for you know it, but for your listeners, well, the story is on January 20th, 2025, one of the first executive orders that Trump initiates is this birthright citizenship. We're eliminating the idea that you can be born in the United States and automatically become a citizen. Immediately, that's challenged in court, and local district courts and even the Ninth Circuit ruled that is unconstitutional. That executive order is unconstitutional and slapped an injunction that goes across the United States. When the Ninth Circuit, for example, slaps on an injunction, that becomes not just a regional West Coast thing, it's a national thing. So the Trump administration wanted to question whether or not those national injunctions are legal. And the Supreme Court, in what is a disastrous opinion, ruled that the answer is no, that a lower court judge slapping on an injunction only applies to the parties in the cases or the small regions of the United States. It doesn't extend beyond to the nation as a whole. That's a bad decision on the Supreme Court's part. So you're right. Now, the Trump administration is thrilled because they may lose at a lower court and they may get a tiny little loss there, but it doesn't expand. Anything that happens at the lower court doesn't expand nationally. And so they're winning a lot. And that's where I think the judiciary is failing.
My first reaction to that case, the national injunctions decision, was, oh, that's not so bad, because I remember the Texas judge who ruled in the the medical abortion bill, that no, this was, withdraw that drug.
Right.
We can't use that anymore. And that was applied nationally. So I said, that makes some sense to me, but you see the total result and it's just awful. You have to win a case to stop a bad practice. You now have to win in courts across the whole country.
That's right. Or do a class action
or
suit,
do a
which are
class act. Right.
super expensive. And when we're talking about civil liberties, often the
Right.
folks can't afford this, right? Or they can't sacrifice all they need to sacrifice to be in a class action suit.
Okay, let's talk a little bit now about timing, because why does a court case take so long, even when it's called expedited? And I understand I've not ever heard, researched, and put together a brief on a case. I imagine that takes considerable amount of study and
Sure.
time. I get it. But why, for example, was a decision about Trump and his criminal liability that took so long to come out that it virtually stopped all the actual criminal action against him?
Yeah, so this is one of the drawbacks of the system itself. Remember my what I originally said when we first started this conversation. I said the Constitution is broken. This
Yes,
is
and
one
I'm
of
going to come
the
back to that.
yeah, this is one of the ways in which the Constitution is broken. The Supreme Court is a deliberative body in a world in that no longer can tolerate the type of deliberation that the Supreme Court has used.
Right,
It's the American politics is too fast now. Social media, technology, all of those things. And so what happens is when the Supreme Court hears oral argument in, December and doesn't make a decision until July, which is the end of the term, you've got a whole lot of time where there's some bad stuff going on.
right,
So, and the reason is because of the way in which the Supreme Court works. The Supreme Court is such that they are talking to each other, and they're talking to each other through their opinions, and they're talking to each other through oral argument. But there's a whole series of decisions that are distributed and then revised, and then it takes a while to do it. But in the fast-paced nature of American politics, the Supreme Court's process, which is very old-fashioned, that Supreme Court process has been broken for a while. I think we need to revise that, and I think we need to make some changes to both the Supreme Court and the Constitution generally.
okay, let's start with the changes to the Supreme Court, because you did mention
Yeah.
that you would reform it. My
Yes.
nomination for first reform is the way the justices are selected. I
Oh,
think
yeah.
Merrick Garland should be a justice. The Amy Coney Bryant's being pushed on the court was so irregular and
Yep.
awful. And it's certainly, aside from how unfair it is to the balance of the court, it
Right.
also hurt badly the reputation of the Supreme Court. So
Oh,
that
for
would
sure.
be my nomination. That the Constitution says when there's a vacancy, the president recommends and the Senate acts, and I think some time limits are required there.
Yeah, so I think that we can talk about the politics of judicial nomination. I totally agree with you, completely agree with you. There is a way to do this the right way, which is term limits for federal court judges. So let's just say the Supreme Court. If you had 18-year term limits for federal court judges and you staggered it with enough time over the next however many years, every president would get 2 nominations, right? And if you gave every president 2 nominations, then I think the American public would understand the importance of the presidential election. Right? What right now we're, you wait. Everybody who's listening to this, when 2028 comes along, the power of the president to nominate Supreme Court justices will be a sideshow in the overall importance. And if you think about things like Dobbs, where the Supreme Court essentially eliminates the right of privacy as it extends to a woman getting an abortion,
Right.
in one fell swoop, and half the country now or more can't get an abortion without leaving the state or whatever.
Right.
then you understand that the stakes are high.
Yes.
So, but the press does not care about it because it's not sexy like, oh, the economy and foreign relations and things like that. But when you go into the vote, when folks go into the voting booth for voting to vote for a president, every single one of them should be thinking about the Supreme Court at that moment because it's super important. So I would do
I
term
actually think
limits.
Republicans have been thinking that
Yeah.
way lately. It's to the detriment of all of us. All right, what's your nomination for first reform needed to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so I want 18-year term
Staggered term.
limits, right? I want just like you said, I want the nomination process to be different. You have to keep people justices with term limits, right? You can't make them electorally accountable. They have to be, because remember, the four institutions of the federal government all represent different constituencies. The House of Representatives is representing local constituencies. The Senate is representing state constituencies. The president is representing a national constituency, and the Supreme Court is representing what we'll describe as a minority constituency. What that means is that the Supreme Court's job is to protect the interests of those who do not have a voice in the political process. That's why you gave Supreme Court justices life tenure and fixed salaries. You don't ever reduce their salary because you want them to be outside of politics. So I don't want any selection process that requires elections like we do at the state court level and so on. I want objective, non democratic justices, but I want each president to have an equal number so that you don't have Trump having three and Biden only getting one, or Trump having three and Jimmy Carter getting zero. So I need that to be the case. So I would do that. 18-year terms, no more. They can be. The other thing that happens, as you know, is that if you don't have 18-year terms, presidents are going to nominate younger and younger people who are going to stay on the court for 50 years and 45 years like Thomas. So that'd be the first thing I do. The second thing I do, and this is a big loss. The second thing I do is you got to reform, as you said, Rosemary, you got to reform the selection process, the nomination and confirmation process. Because what we get, as much as I might love certain justices in my lifetime, you get justices who are inexperienced and largely uncontroversial. So
Mhm.
Stephen Breyer, Justice Souter, right?
Mhm.
Kavanaugh, Barrett. These people are not intellectual giants, right?
Nope.
I liked everything Stephen Breyer said, and I liked how Souter moves to the left, but they're not intellectual giants like Louis Brandeis, Oliver Wendell Holmes, right? John Marshall, these great jurists. Oliver Wendell
The
Holmes was like
giants.
the Davy Crockett. He was like this folk hero. He's an intellectual giant.
Well,
Louis Brandeis.
Even Bork was an
Even
intellectual giant.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
he was too controversial to go on the court because of
that's
the
right.
process.
And the process has become so political that you don't get intellectually capable people.
Right.
You get
Right.
people like me, who's like an intellectual low weight and low life, and that's not what we want for the highest court in the land.
We could get Eileen Cannon anytime now.
Yeah.
The rumor is that Thomas is going to step down and Trump will put her in.
Oh, I think
I
Thomas will
can
step down for
I
sure.
know, well, I have my son who teaches at the high school level and
Hmm.
studies the Supreme Court says, well, we can't do worse.
Yeah,
You
right.
don't, you can't, you're going to end up as bad. You can't be worse. So,
That's
okay,
right.
I have one other reform that is easier, doesn't require a constitutional amendment, I don't think, but there needs to be an ethics code for justices with teeth in it. I'm
That's
sorry,
right.
Clarence Thomas should be in jail. What he did
I
was
I could
totally corrupt.
Couldn't agree more. And that is easy, and it shows what that shows is a couple of things. The fact that we don't have that shows that Roberts has no power
Yep.
because if Rehnquist was doing that, Berger not so much, But can you imagine Earl
Right.
Warren
Oh my
not?
God, Earl Warren
Oh my
stepped
God.
down over nothing.
Right, right. Well, can you imagine? I mean, I always think it's funny. The Brown versus Board of Education, the greatest case in the history of the Supreme Court. It didn't make a difference on the ground, but it was the greatest case in the history of the Supreme Court. Earl Warren strong-armed those justices to
Absolutely.
go unanimous. He would absolutely have said to his fellow justices, "We're going to have an ethics policy with teeth." Roberts can't get that. And
Nope, he did
that's
not. It should
that's
not be called the Roberts Court. He does not have control over it.
that's so true.
Okay, is it your theory that Alito leaked the overturning of the Roe v. Wade case?
I think the answer is if it's not Alito, it's somebody associated with them because
Yeah.
they feared so
Yep.
so mightily that Kavanaugh was gonna switch.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
they needed to keep Kavanaugh on board. And the fact of the matter is, think about it, right? So these are prideful people. And if Kavanaugh is seen as wishy-washy on the one case that everybody's paying attention to, he would never be able to live that reputation down. So it was actually I think it was, again, criminal. But I think
Sinister. I
from a
think your word is
political,
sinister. Yeah,
yes,
politically it was
sinister.
smart. Yeah,
Politically, it was super smart because Kavanaugh is now caught, and I think
yeah,
I think it's true. Think about it. That's a 6-3 decision about the
it's great.
upholding of
Yeah,
the Mississippi law, but it's a 5-4 decision about overturning Roe versus Wade, and Kavanaugh was waffling.
he was the person.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, how come we can't amend the Constitution anymore? We used to be able to do that.
Yeah. It's because we're too polarized. B, the Article 5 of the Constitution has always been too hard of a hill to climb, right? And remember, we have 27 amendments. 11 of those amendments were drafted by Madison in 1788 and 1789. And by 11, I'm talking about the Bill of Rights and the last one, right? The 27th Amendment. People think the 27th Amendment is an amendment that requires two subsequent Congresses to vote for a pay raise. You can't just vote yourself a pay raise. You got to get the next Congress to vote a pay raise.
Right.
That amendment was part of Madison's original list of amendments when he proposed it in 1789. So it just took that long for it to be
Just a couple
ratified.
100 years.
Yeah,
That's
just
all.
200 years, no problem. The hill is too hard to climb. It's the iron bar of our Constitution because it requires 2/3 of both houses to vote in favor of an amendment and then ratified by 3/4 of the states. That's just too much to overcome. It's too high of a bar.
When I saw Roe v. Wade fall, I had fears looking at the power that Republicans had built across the country by working slowly and at the state level and the local level and then up to the national level, that we would end up with a constitutional conference, the convention, the first one since the 1700s, and
Yeah.
that it would be disastrous because, of course, it would be in the hands of conservatives. Do you have similar fears, or am I crazy to worry about that?
Well, I think your fears are justified if the convention membership is done in particular ways. I think you can get convention delegates that represent a wide swath of American society. So I'm a little more hopeful. I don't think we're going to have a constitutional convention because I think we're too polarized. But if we did have a constitutional convention, I'm a little more hopeful that it would be a representative group of people. So uh, here's an example, right? Sure, we're not going to have 55 men like we did in 1787 who agree to be in secret. You can't do that anymore in Philadelphia, but you could have 535 members of a constitutional convention where 435, the number of House of
Mhm.
members, 435 are randomly selected just like jury duty. And then
Mhm.
100, two from each state, would be quote unquote experts that the state legislature could pick. if you did that, you would get a wide range and swath of the American population, and then a convention would be worthwhile. And I always say this when people are like, no, you can't do that. South Africa was able to rewrite their constitution beautifully. Now they can't, it's hard to administer, but they rewrote their constitution when Mandela gets out of prison in 92 and 96. And if South Africa, which was as polarized and divided and racist as any country in the history of humankind, was able to do it, I think we could do it in 2026 or 2027.
It was pretty inspiring to watch Tunisia in the early 2000s after the Arab Spring put together a constitution, a country that had been under a dictator for generations. And that's when I began thinking, why it was supposed to happen here. Jefferson and Madison never thought that the document they put together was going to go on for, hundreds of years.
239 and going and still going.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Still going.
Jefferson thought every generation ought to write its own constitution.
Redo it. That's
right.
So they used to talk, or I guess they still talk about it, but I don't think they really pretend to do it anymore. Originalism, that you were going to decide law based on the original intent of the founding fathers. Have we given that up, or is there still any merit to that at all? I never understood how you were going to decide issues like abortion or gun control, for example, thinking of like the founding fathers who had none of the same technology that we do.
I mean, that's the big question, and the answer is, unfortunately, it has been resurrected by the Alitos and Thomas. Thomas was always, because Thomas and Scalia. Remember, Scalia is the great originalist.
Absolutely. Well, he was a great intellectual, even though
he was a giant, right? I disagree with everything he said, but he was a giant, and so was
Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, yeah.
Exactly.
You go to the opera together.
That's right. So Thomas has always been an originalist. There's no there with originalism. That's what drives me bonkers, right? It's a hollow judicial interpretation scheme, because you can pick anything you want. So you could go back to the original drafting of the Constitution or the original drafting of the 14th Amendment and say, oh, yeah, the original meaning was this or that based on who you're listening to, right? So first of all, if you're talking about originalism, are you going to listen only to the Madisons and the 39 delegates who signed the Constitution? Are you going to listen only to what the ratifiers meant? Right? Mm-hmm. Are you going to listen to what the general public meant in 1787? So you can just pick and choose. That's why it's a ridiculous, hollow, just shameful interpretive theory. Now, here's the problem, though, Rosemary. The problem is that so many of the conservatives on the court and the lower courts abide by it because they believe it controls judicial power. Not true. But they abide by it, and you see Dobbs. Dobbs is a good example where Alito's writing an opinion saying, well, there was no abortion. Abortion was illegal back when the 14th Amendment, and Stephen Breyer's like, well, of course, the 14th Amendment wasn't written by people. It was written by men. No women were involved in the 14th Amendment. So how can you be an originalist and say the people wanted X? The people didn't want X. No women or Native Americans or enslaved persons or whatever were involved in any of that. That's absurd.
Right. The whole document is like steeped in the racism of our early years.
That's right.
No way around it. And also ridiculous to me is the theory of activist judges. They're all activists. When you make a decision with that much power behind it, of course it's activism.
Of course. I mean, the fact of the matter is, there's this. I tell listeners all the time, I think about the fact that in the Warren Court, he was the Warren era, which basically was 1953 to 1969. This was a period in which he was accused of being activist, and the justices were accused of being activists, I would argue that they were following what was the vision, tradition, mission, and fundamental principles of American liberty, right? So this notion of freedom. So whether it's Miranda or Brown or Gideon versus Wainwright, which protects the constitutional right to an attorney, these were all part of Magna Carta. They were part of what
Right.
the original framers wanted. And so you can't call the Warren era activism because they are protecting those.
Right.
Now, right? I always say this, it's fascinating. What is the most, people ask me all the time, what's the most impactful decision in my lifetime? I'm 50, I'm almost 60 years old. The most impactful decision probably is Citizens United, as we talked about.
Right.
But there's a case, right? US versus Lopez, 1992, where the Supreme Court says to Congress, you don't have the power to regulate guns in schools.
Right.
That case was huge. And that case was gigantic because it erased 60 years of Congress being able to regulate moral and racial and economic activity through the Commerce Clause. It erased 60 years of that. Conservative, that is activism
It sure is.
at its height.
Well, I mean, William Douglas, to take a completely different judge, that was activism in to push for conservation and environmentalism before there was an environmental movement.
Of course.
Yeah, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and rights of women.
Yeah, I'll
Thurgood
always take
Marshall.
this. I'll always take this opportunity to say the two greatest litigators in the history of the United States are Thurgood Marshall, the one about race, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg about gender.
This really fascinating discussion I'm having is with Beau Breslin, who is really, I would like to take one of your courses now at Skidmore College in Saratoga, and we're running out of time, and I only have about 48 more questions. You have to promise to come back.
We'll do it again.
Yes, we will. Let's do a couple more, though. I have been reading Doris Kearns Goodwin book, An Unfinished Love Story, about the 60s.
Yeah.
It seems like such a far away and naive time,
Yeah.
filled with hope. And there's, of course, whole sections that she and her husband, Dick Goodwin, are writing about their work, bringing about the civil rights and especially the Voting Rights Act, which this Roberts Court has been systematically dismantling. Can you explain that? Why there is a view that, okay, we did it, it's all fixed, let's move on, and they're undoing it.
Yeah, I mean you hit the nail on the head. You hit the nail on the head. The conservatives on the Roberts court have regularly said exactly what you said. We're sort of in this post-racial society. They don't use that term, but somehow we've emerged beyond, and that the southern states that have a long-standing history of blocking African Americans from voting have now moved beyond that, and that they can be trusted. I don't think they can be trusted, right? I think, quite frankly,
I've not seen any proof of it. No,
that's right.
No progress.
Yeah, and so they're slowly dismantling the Voting Rights Acts and the Civil Rights Acts of the 60s. Now, here's my bigger issue, Rosemary. I think there are particular moments in American history where we have shown our dignity, grace, our enlightenment thinking, right? And the 60s, whether you were on the left or on the right, this was a period of time in which, as I said before, in which we decided we were going to double down on those central pillars of American freedom. And the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Acts of the mid-60s, those were sort of the high point of those. I would add Brown and so on, Miranda and some of these other cases. But these are the great moments of celebration that all Americans ought to rally behind. And here we're slowly chipping away at them, whether it's the Roberts Court or the Trump administration, as if those weren't the greatest moments in American history.
It's appalling. Have you made any kind of accounting of what clauses and or amendments are really under attack right now? It isn't just voting rights that's being hammered away or chipped away at. I mean, the First Amendment,
Yep.
the FCC is threatening news stations for reporting on the war. Geez.
Yep.
And the Second Amendment, beloved by the right, yet protesters in Minneapolis had no right to come to a protest with a gun that they had a license for.
Right.
So that's under trouble.
Fourth Amendment search and seizure.
Yes, sir.
You know, there are almost every meaningful right. I wouldn't count the Third Amendment, right? The quartering of soldiers, but almost every
soldiers living in our houses.
Yeah, no, I don't think that one's a serious one, but almost every meaningful right that I'll remind everybody, many of which come as far back as 1215 in the Magna Carta, are, you know, Madison believed in these rights. They are in state constitutions.
Right.
They are the epitome of what our experiment in republicanism, small r republicanism. But these rights are being chipped away. But the greatest threat to our freedom is the chipping away of the 14th Amendment. The way in, because remember, you know, for the most part, up until the Trump administration, the federal government wasn't interfering so much in our rights, but states regularly, every day, infringe on our rights. And that 14th Amendment says no state shall, ... That's the one we ought to pay more attention to. And that's the one that I'm most nervous about, because the Trump administration is more than willing to eliminate the central pillars of the 14th Amendment. And I'm worried that the court is going to let them do it.
Going to go away with it. Oh my goodness. Okay. I shouldn't really end it this way. We're getting really close. I'm going to pick out of all my whole list in front of me one more. The Mar-a-Lago case. That one continues to really bother. Jack Smith has made a very strong argument for releasing his report, at least find out what he had that will never hurt Trump, apparently.
Agreed.
Do you think that'll come out? Is Aileen Cannon really going to end up on the Supreme Court as a reward for protecting Trump? Has it really gotten that bad that she's recognized as an inexperienced, unqualified judge, and she did this? Is she going to get away with it?
The answer is so about Cannon. The answer is probably because the Senate is a bunch of sycophants, right, on the right. The Senate is going to let her any Supreme Court justice go through. And I think that's problematic. Next time we talk, we should talk about the nuclear option, the way in which the Senate is no longer a viable block to Supreme Court nominations and so on.
We don't have three branches of government anymore.
We don't. And that's partly our fault, because we're still voting our people into office. Most Americans love their Congress member, but can't stand the institution. And if you can't stand the institution, you got to take a look maybe at your Congress member. Remember I said the Constitution is broken. I'm all for term limits for Congress members. And I think it's ridiculous that we don't have term limits for Congress members, because professionalization of Congress has been a real problem. But I think Jack Smith's report will come out. And I think Cannon has as good a shot as anybody of replacing Thomas as in the near future. And
okay, well, I hold with my view that she cannot be worse than Thomas, even she.
That's true. Cannot be worse. That is absolutely true. He's a wacky, quirky guy, and a terrible jurist, but can't get worse.
We traditionally end our podcast with a toast, and it's supposed to be hopeful and looking to the future. You have made that very hard for me tonight. So I'm going to raise my glass, which I need to immediately refill after this, to fixing our broken Constitution.